Justice, Supreme Court Justice, and also Ombudswoman Conchita Carpio-Morales. Thank you very much, ma'am and sir, for joining us. So before we go to the meat of discussions, and because obviously I'm going to interview both of you because of what the ICC communication that you filed. But before going that, what we tend to do in this show is we ask about the background very briefly of our guests. So we ask, for instance, Prime Minister Mahathir, why did he join politics to begin with? And with Justice Carpio, for instance, we ask him, how did he get involved in the West Philippine Sea issue? Or with Secretary Lorenzana, how did he ended up in the cabinet of President Duterte? So may I ask you first, Ambassador de Rosario, how did you end up as a Foreign Secretary of the Philippines or in the diplomatic realm? From what I know, you're a very successful businessman, right? What brought you into the public service realm, particularly in the realm of diplomacy?
That's a good question because I don't remember anymore how I got into this. But at some point, being in public service had never entered my mind. And at one point, I received a phone call in the evening from a lady who identified herself as the vice president. And she asked if I would have dessert with her. And so I went to visit then Vice President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. It seems that this was a time when there was this impeachment process being applied to ERAP. And the Vice President wanted me to go to the United States to be able to prepare them for a possible change of government. So I took the next plane out and then I did that. So then I came back and I said, these are the people I saw, these are the people that I talked with, preparing them for a possible change in our government. After that, another 3 days, he says, can you go back again? Because it's coming close. So, good soldier, I went back, and by the time I arrived, the government had changed already. So, I was invited to a businessman's social, and the new president walked in, and she went straight for me. She said, would you like to go to Washington for me? So that's how I found myself in Washington, D.C.
And then you served as an ambassador for a number of years until you had to resign again?
No, I was fired.
Oh, you were fired?
I served
What were the circumstances, if people are not aware of this?
I served 5 years as ambassador to the U.S. And at one point in time, I think Vice President, the President then, President Arroyo, had certain challenges in an election, and she sent someone to me to ask if I could support the lifting of the writ of habeas corpus.
Right.
So I said I couldn't do that because I felt that that would make us a failed state. So then they sent another person to me 2 weeks later to say, how about I support emergency rule?
Right.
So I said, well, I can't do that either, because I said if we did that to the fourth estate, the international community would come down on us. So after then, they didn't talk to me anymore, and at some point in time, I was given a ticket to go back home.
So you came into public service under more or less emergency circumstances, and you were kind of forcibly had to exit politics under emergency circumstances. And then later on, of course, you came back, but this time as the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs, right? Under President
that's
Aquino.
right. Well, I was when I was brought back as ambassador, I was they managed it so that it looked like I was retiring.
Right.
So at every chance, I said I was not about to retire. I was being fired. So I told the whole world this, and that's the truth, right? So Anyway, 5 years later, I received a call from President Benigno Aquino, who I had not met,
Right.
and he says he'd like to come over and have a conversation with you. As soon as I walked in, he said to me, I heard that you are a fighter for democracy.
Right.
So I said, well, sir, I don't know about that, sir. I'm here. I don't really know what it is that you wish of me. He says, well, I want you to serve as Secretary of Foreign Affairs. It was as simple as that.
And then, of course, you were also involved in a lot of other things as the Foreign Secretary of the Philippines under President Aquino, including the Philippines' historic decision to take China to international court over the South China Sea dispute, something that has never happened. It's unprecedented. Very briefly, what were the circumstances of that decision? Why did you think that taking to China was the only way forward? Because for a lot of us, we were watching President Aquino. He came out strong against Chinese investments, particularly the NB and ZTE, which were embroiled in corruption. But he later on visited President Hu Jintao in China in 2011. So there was kind of this feeling that we're moving towards rapprochement with China. But I believe perhaps the Scarborough Shoal crisis was kind of something that made folks like you to decide to push for a much more, I would say, confrontational position towards China.
Yeah, well, very early on, I think everyone could see that China was looking to be a superpower. That one of their strategic interests was to have their own lake, and they wanted the South China Sea as their lake for various reasons. One is they need to feed their people. Secondly, they need to fuel their economy. And thirdly, there was a need for projecting their navy. So this was the Chinese strategy, and they worked around the position that they had indisputable sovereignty over
inherent and indisputable.
Yes, those are the words, and this is, of course, is represented by the 9-dash line. We tried our very best to. China was unrelenting in terms of its position, and I think what happened, as people tell me, is at the ASEAN level, they were looking for countries that would be weak enough for them to persuade being on their side. And the Philippines, I heard, was one of those countries. But we did not come up to their expectations. We wanted to take a position that what is ours is ours. And we undertook every possible means to come up with a solution, durable solution, peaceful one. Nothing worked. Bilaterals, multilaterals, nothing worked. And finally, I suggested to the president that we look at the possibility of embarking on a legal track.
Right.
And the president asked me, "What is your level of confidence?" I said, very high, Mr. President. We just need to get some good people on board, because we need to just disprove that the 9-dash line does not work in favor of anybody, that it is in fact an excessive claim that's unlawful. And once we are able to do that, then the whole thing falls apart. So the president was very supportive. he thought that the recommendation was sound, and then we put on people who were also going to support the effort, and so we had a cabinet meeting where they were also present. The past presidents were there: Ramos, Estrada, Gloria Arroyo was not there; she was in the hospital. We also had the Speaker, the Senate President, and at that time, Senator Trillanes was also present, and he had his own view as to where we should go with this. So we both presented our views, and then after the presentation of views, there was dialogue, and at a certain point, I mentioned to the president that we need to come to a conclusion, because we need to do it today at this time, or if we don't do it today at this time, then the chances of success is very low, because China would somehow find out that this is what the direction we're headed.
So the Scarborough incident was very important, right? I mean, I think, was that kind of a wake-up call? That China is not a country that we can peacefully come with a compromise or arrangement with?
Well, I was asked that question in an earlier interview today. What happened in Scarborough? I think we had an impasse there. At some point, we had one vessel, one ship, vis-a-vis 33 ships for China inside the shoal, and there was this impasse, and as I recall, there was a Chinese visitor to Washington D.C., and Washington D.C. had called the ambassador to the United States, ambassador to the Philippines from the United States, and Joey Quisha had also called me, and to say that there was this possibility of an impasse being broken and a deal being struck. So we listened to what was being proposed, and actually what was proposed was a simultaneous pullout of their 33 ships and
mutual
ours.
disengagement.
Yeah. So we thought that was a good idea. That we had an honest broker, which is the United States. When it was time to pull out, we pulled out, and China did not pull out. And so we went back to the brokers and said what happened, and so they said, well, the Chinese are just a little slow in moving, but they will pull out. They never pulled out.
So deception, that was a very clear case of deception.
Well, a breach of agreement at the very least, right?
Right,
Yeah.
which showed kind of a bad faith. Of course, the other thing that you did was negotiating the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreements. So on one hand, we tried to stand up to China through a legal warfare or lawfare strategy, but also you oversaw our negotiation of ways to upgrade our alliance. What was the rationale for the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement? Weren't the previous agreements sufficient, the Visiting Forces Agreement or Mutual Defense Treaty in general? Why was the EDCA very important as far as defending our interests in the West Philippine Sea was concerned?
I think I'm trying to remember who the president was at that time. At any rate, I thought that there needed to be a closer relationship between our two countries, especially since China was on the rise, and from what I recall, which may be accurate, which may not be accurate because I'm not sure about my memory anymore, is we thought that EDCA was very important because it resulted in a restoration of our relationship with the United States, that on a revolving basis they would be present in the Philippines, and that also there would be a prepositioning of equipment that would
including weapons, right?
Including
as
weapons.
a form of deterrence against further Chinese.
That's correct.
encroachment.
That's correct.
That's very important because I'll try to go back to that later because this administration took quite a different position. But a little bit fast forward. So we filed the arbitration award. Admittedly, a lot of people were skeptical at first, and this will bring us to the ICC issue later on, including myself and some of my colleagues. We were skeptical at first. But eventually the decision came out, and of course as the proceedings moved forward, we became more and more optimistic as we got to know actually the strength of our legal position and the international support that it was gathering. Did you expect the result to be that kind of a slam dunk? Right? Everyone was expecting that this is not going to go China's way, but it's like we got everything, right? With the exception of the second Thomas Scholl, whereby it was ruled as a military issue. But did you expect it to be as good in terms of the final result?
I thought that all we needed to do was to invalidate the 9-dash line, which was very simple for us to do. And we were able to do that. And so my confidence was high, remained high at all times. And I was of course very happy, but I was not totally unsurprised by the results of the arbitral tribunal. Yeah.
And wasn't it? I mean, we were expecting the results to come out towards the end of the Aquino administration, right? And yet it came towards a different administration. Was that unexpected? The timing of the result? Because
I think it came 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Is it 2 weeks or 2 months after?
I think 2 weeks. Yeah,
2
later
weeks
than
after.
ours.
Yeah. So we expected that we would celebrate, but we didn't.
It was left to the next administration.
That's
and
right.
I suppose you tried to explain to the incoming administration the importance of this endeavor, right?
No, I did not do that. I just thought that we had accomplished something that's good for the country, and we're happy to do that.
Right. Going back to you, Justice Ombudsman Carpio-Morales. So, what is your? So you went through the ranks, or you started straight in the Supreme Court Justice before moving to the Ombudsman
I went
office?
through the ranks. I was with the Department of Justice.
Right.
From there, I joined the judiciary. From the judiciary, well, as a regional trial court judge in Camarines Sur. Then I was transferred as a regional trial court judge in Pasay. Then from there, I went to the Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court.
And later on, you also took the job of being an ombudswoman.
That's
right?
correct.
I'm sure that was not the easiest decision. I've seen some of your interviews and discussions regarding that. But why did you take the job of the Ombudsman office? And for the purpose of our audience, I mean, I think everyone knows what is more or less the job of a foreign secretary, right? But I think unfortunately, or what is the job of a Supreme Court justice. But I think a lot of people in the Philippines and around the world are not very aware of what is the job of an ombudswoman and why is this very crucial in a democracy like ours.
Well, I finally accepted the nomination to be an ombudsman after everyone was talking about my age. They said I was too old for the position, although ambivalent at first because I wanted to enjoy the luxury of retirement as a Supreme Court justice, but because even a past ombudsman was saying that we needed a young chicken to head the office of the ombudsman. You know, I was incensed. I was pissed off. I said, a young person might be qualified, but if he is not competent, or he is not honest, or he does not have integrity, then I said, let me take the nomination. So I did take the nomination. And the president, that was President Aquino, limited the interview to 3 of us finalists. But fortunately, I made it. So the Ombudsman is an independent office. I'm talking about the Philippine Ombudsman.
Right.
It's an independent office created to handle complaints against government officials and private individuals who are in conspiracy with these government officials, primarily to check abuses, especially violation of the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, and all other crimes that are committed in relation to the discharge of the office of the public officer.
Ombudswoman, what was your experience? Because, in the Philippines we have this problem that generally it's presumed that, if you win elections, you have democratic mandate, and it seems we are also very personalistic in terms of our understanding of politics. We talk about administrations, presidents, and individuals, but of course we know that institutions are also very important, right? And also checks and balances and accountability within the state institutions are very important.
In fact, you wrote about having to have strong institutions.
Right. I mean, you
And I said that too.
Yes.
Right.
I think you said we need strong institutions, not strong
Not
men,
strong men.
right? Or
Right.
strong women, for
That's
that
right.
matter, right? What do you mean by that? Why is it important for us to have strong
Well,
institutions?
for as long as the institution is strong, we did not need to have a strong man to man
Right.
it. All you have to do was to follow to a T what was expected for you to do under the strong institution. But if you have a strong man who commits abuses, no matter how strong the institution is, you will fail.
Right. And when it comes to the strong institution, what do we mean by strong? What is the indicator to say that it's a strong institution? Is it the ability to hold anyone, regardless of your position in power, accountable? Is that the greatest?
Among other things, it
Right.
includes that because when the rule of law is being followed, you apply to all irrespective of the position, irrespective of the status in life. So you apply the rule of law. You are not selective. You don't have double standard.
Can you define to our audience, what is rule of law? What does that really mean? Because
Well-
people make a distinction between rule of law and rule by law, right?
Usually when you talk of rule of law, you mean that you apply the law equally.
Right.
In other words, you do not apply the law to a certain poor fellow because he is weak,
Right.
and you will not apply it to a person who is rich.
Right.
In other words, you apply the law equally.
Right.
That is
And
the
predictably.
usual.
And predictably, right?
Predictably, yes. That is the usual connotation of the application of the rule of law.
Right. And is the Office of Ombudsman, you think, sufficiently empowered in terms of budget, in terms of individuals, in terms of respect from other agencies of the government to do its job? Because its job is very important, right?
Yes.
To make sure that public officials, either on their own or in connivance with private citizens, do not violate our constitutional principles, right?
In fact, we have a very strong Office of the Ombudsman. When the framers of the 1986-87 Constitution were considering the experiences under the martial law regime,
Right.
the regime of Ferdinand Marcos, they saw to it that never again would the abuses committed thereunder would be repeated. So they saw to it that we have a strong office of the Ombudsman. And in fact, we like to take pride in the fact that if the Philippines is not the most powerful, if the Philippines does not have the most powerful ombudsman in the entire world, at least it is one of them.
Right. And at least in
Because-
the region, right? We
Right.
are-
Because there are some office of the ombudsman who can only investigate and recommend what to do. Because there's another office who would assess the recommendation and conduct preliminary investigation and recommend to the head of office what action to take. But in the case of the Philippine Ombudsman, the Ombudsman conducts fact-finding investigation. After that, it conducts preliminary investigation. After that, it files the case in court if the Ombudsman finds probable cause. And the Ombudsman has a prosecution arm
Right.
which prosecutes the case in court.
Ombudsman, a while ago with the Secretary of Rosario, we were talking about what were the key achievements or highlights of his term as a foreign secretary and, of course, even ambassador. What were the highlights during your term as an ombudswoman?
Well,
Without going to maybe specifics of each case, but the most you think this will shape your legacy and also legacy of the Ombudsman office.
I was bold enough to put to jail those people against whom I thought were liable under the law. I was able to put to jail a former president, 3 senators, some congressmen, and some other rascals from other bureaus and government institutions.
That's very reassuring, right? And we hope that this sets the standard for your successor. So we are talking about rule of law here. Foreign Secretary de Rosario, how important is rule of law on the international level in terms of relationship among states? Because this is very related to your decision to take China to international court. Because at least in the local context, we can say that we have a clear state, right? And that state has a certain jurisdiction. So in short, implementations of law is much more straightforward, right? But the argument is when you go to the international level and relationship among equally sovereign state, perhaps rule of law is not as poignant or robust. Why do you think still rule of law matters, even in terms of relationship among countries? You always say that otherwise we have a rule of jungle, right? I remember your speech in the United Nations, I think it was back in 2013, right? When you talk about we only have 2 options, right? Either rule of law or rule of jungle. Could you expound on that?
I think the international rules-based system was started after World War II with the United Nations, and it's a move to be able to establish, as you say, the rule of law that you would want all countries to abide by. Without the rule of law, you have chaos.
Right.
And so the rule of law is something that is important, especially since you have big countries and small countries, powerful countries, less powerful countries. But the great equalizer is actually the rule of law.
And this is the question always people tell. I mean, it's strange to hear. It seems some people in this country sometimes arguing in favor of another country. A lot of people are saying, why should China care about international law? It's a powerful country, the 2nd largest economy, probably the 3rd most powerful military. They can just ignore international law. Anyways, who's going to enforce international law? What do you have to tell these people? Why would China care about this arbitration award, about the international law? Why would they care?
I don't know if China cares about the rule of law, because on the basis of what we see and the practices of China, the rule of law doesn't seem to mean much to them. For example, if you have UNCLOS, which they're signatory to, they adhere to the parts of UNCLOS that benefit them
selectively
and ignore selectively those that do not benefit them. So I think China is of the mind that might is right.
Right.
And I think this is not correct, of course. And I've been trying to understand China all these years, but I failed to do that.
Is there so you as a foreign secretary, you dealt with China for at least 5 years. What was one of the key lessons you got from dealing with the Chinese? Because there's a lot of debate about what is China. We know all that China is powerful, but what kind of power, or whether it could be a good leader in this part of the world, that's something that everyone is still discussing. From your experience as secretary, how do you view China? What kind of power is rising over the horizon?
Well, I said something this morning, which I was reminded earlier, was what do I remember about my dealings with China?
Right, from those 5 years as a foreign secretary.
And I think that what I had observed, and this was personal experience, is that China is, if you ask China, or if you listen to China's declarations, you can be sure that it's the opposite of what's happening on the ground.
It's alternative facts.
Yes, yes, and you also deal with, even on a lower level, you find that the information flow is not accurate. And when you check with other countries to see if you are reading things wrongly,
Right.
no, you're not. That's the way they are. That's the feedback from other countries as well. So dealing with China is very, very, very difficult.
So, how do you feel, Ambassador, when you have our current president saying something like, I love China, China will help us, kind of implying that China is a future and is a very dependable partner for developing the country and protecting our interests? How do you feel about that when our current president says things like that about China?
I think he has not assessed the character of China very well. I think that in time he will be able to know China for what China really is. But right now I think he is trying to maximize the economic benefits, so he says, that he can muster from this relationship. But we're not really making any real progress with China
On the ground.
on the ground. Well, I hope the president succeeds.
And appreciates certain facts about China. Going back to Justice and Ombudsman Carpio, I mean, our president also has a lot to say about our constitution, about our democracy. Even from the time he was running for presidency, he was threatening to shut down the Congress. As someone who worked both in the judiciary and also in the Ombudsman office, a lawyer, right, who appreciates the strength of institutions, how do you feel when our president speaks in those terms, directly challenging perhaps the fundamental liberal character of our constitution?
Of course, I'm disappointed because for as long as the Constitution remains as a Constitution, you should never deviate from it. You should not mutilate it.
Right.
You should follow its provisions and show to people that you yourself are law-abiding. So it disappoints us when someone says that, that provision in the Constitution is no good, or that provision in the Constitution was not meant to be there in the first place.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you hear even some people saying that the Constitution is more normative or prescriptive rather than the final say of the laws that the land agrees upon. I mean, and of course there are even discussion that maybe we needed the Constitution to change to better reflect the interests of the people.
Well, for as long as you change the provisions of the Constitution to suit circumstances that had in the meantime developed, it would be good. But if you want to change the Constitution to install something that you personally wish but is not good for the sake of the country or for the welfare of the entire country, that is something to be alarmed about.
So this brings me now to the reason why we're together primarily here. Both of you, of course, retired from politics. You more recently...
No, not politics.
I retired from public service, I'm
yes,
sorry.
That's more precise.
I think none of us will ever retire from politics in whatever capacity. But now, of course, you're back in the middle of our discussions, and in a way, I'm sure you're also doing public service. When you decided to file this communication to the International Criminal Court against, no less than, some would say, the most powerful man on earth, President Xi Jinping of China. I mean, the American president is powerful, but he doesn't have absolute control over all the institutions of the state. But the Chinese president can say this and everything will follow. First of all, why did you decide to be so directly involved in in a way you're now shaping the foreign policy of the country, although informally, and why did you decide to file this case in the International Criminal Court and against, personally, President Xi Jinping? Ambassador?
I'll let you answer
Or
that.
Justice?
All right.
What were the circumstances? Very.
All right. I sound like a broken record, but what I gather is that the ambassador and a few of his friends would, in their regular meetings, would be discussing, among other things, what they can do for the welfare of the country, even
Right.
if it is not them who would ultimately
Make the decision.
yes, make the decision. And so, in the course of their discussions, it came to them that perhaps, given the friendliness, the accommodation
Right.
that the administration had been showing the Chinese, they expected a reciprocal accommodation
Right.
from the Chinese, but they were mistaken. And so, when the effectivity of the withdrawal drew near,
Right.
they thought that something had to be done in order to alleviate the suffering of our, among others,
Right.
fishermen.
Yes.
All right. So they mulled on it for a few days, and then they asked me later if I was minded to join the group. I said, let me reflect on it. I went over the briefer, I went over the text of the
Right.
transmittal letter and the introduction, and I did a little research on the ICC and
Right.
the system in the ICC at The
Right.
Hague.
Yeah.
By the way, I went to The Hague
Right.
in late October last year, and I was privileged to have been briefed by junior officials
Right.
about the workings of The Hague.
Right.
So it was something that I relished when I was invited to join.
And you did your
the-
assignment. I mean, you tried to really
Yes,
understand
yes.
the
So when I
mechanism.
finally thought that the cause, that is the filing of the communication
Right.
to the Office of the Prosecutor, was meritorious, I
Mm.
readily informed the group that, yes, I'm ready to co-sign the communication. That's how I got in.
And Ambassador, I mean, is this kind of connected also to our arbitration award? I mean, you were very much involved in taking China to court. Is this like a second attempt at taking China to the court? And this time, specifically, the president of China. Is this a continuation of that effort, or this for you it's something separate and different?
Well, I think there's a basic difference. In the case of the arbitral tribunal, it was a state-to-state transaction, whereas in this in the ICC, we are after individuals who
Right.
may have committed a crime against the Philippines.
And of course, when it comes to ICC, they have different crimes, mass atrocities that they cover. Obviously, this is not the case of genocide. Some would have thought that maybe this is a case of crimes of aggression, right? But we know that there are certain jurisdictional issues when it comes to the ICC. So what you chose was crimes against humanity
Yes.
as the basis to accuse President Xi Jinping of essentially committing mass atrocities. Why did you? On what basis do we can you accuse President Xi Jinping of committing crimes against humanity, and humanity of whom specifically?
Well, there are elements expressed in terms of pursuing a crime against humanity, and these elements include planning with the government plan. There must be a government plan. There must be.
So it should be systematic and state-sponsored.
Systematic, state-sponsored.
Right.
You need to identify a group of civilians who you will be targeting.
Right. As decision makers.
Yes, and so we thought that the fact that we could go after individuals under the ICC jurisdiction was precisely the international
Court.
court that we were looking for. So that's how we're pursuing. As you said, we have submitted our paper, and we're waiting for a commentary in terms of what we need to do next.
I mean, Ambassador in Justice, of course, our fisher folks were very much part of our arbitration award against China, right? Because they have been deprived of their right to have access to our traditional fishing ground, right? And we have a lot of cases of harassment against our fishermen. So in the case of ICC, we're also talking about crimes committed against our fishermen. We're accusing the Chinese leadership of committing that. It's the humanity of our fishermen which is being violated here.
Yes, yes. And some of the evidence that we will be asked to produce, or that we've already sent to The Hague, comports to what we had to do in the arbitral tribunal.
Right.
So
And that's where they're connected. Right?
There's some vetting already that's been
Exactly.
done.
So you can connect those two. Ambassador Justice Carpio-Morales. Well, some would say, isn't it strange that we are filing this just before our withdrawal takes effect? Did this also have to indirectly do with perhaps your reservations or criticism of the decision of this government to withdraw from the ICC? Because are we trying to remind people that ICC is important and we could actually leverage it to protect the interests of our citizens?
Well, as I earlier said, we were hoping that China would modify its tack against the Philippines, but it did not. So since the effectivity of the withdrawal drew near, we thought that if we did not file the communication to the Office of the Prosecutor within the period of effectivity of our membership, we might be technically out of the loop. So we did file it before the effectivity of the withdrawal of the membership of the Philippines.
I mean, you're a justice, you're a lawyer, you worked through the judiciary for all those years. How do you feel about the Philippines withdrawing from the ICC? I think many people misunderstand it. They keep on saying, oh, well, United States is not part of ICC, China is not. But actually, the Philippines is the only second country after Burundi, right, to have ratified it all those years going through the process and then now suddenly withdrawing, right? So that puts us in a very strange group of countries, right? Not to mention now a country like Malaysia, under no less than Prime Minister Mahathir, actually has just joined the ICC among 122 other countries. So, as someone who worked in the judiciary, as a former justice, as a former ombudswoman, how do you feel about the Philippines withdrawing and becoming only the second country to withdraw
Richard,
from the ICC?
The case has been submitted for decision. It would be sub judice for me to come up with a comment. So I'd rather not comment.
All right, no problem about that. Thank you very much. Now, the thing is, of course, you're doing your part in order to make sure that we can leverage international law to protect the interests of our citizens. But what do you think ordinary people can do in terms of helping to protect the interests of our country? Why should ordinary Filipinos even care about what's happening there all the way in the West Philippine Sea? Why do you think it's important, Foreign Secretary, for an ordinary Filipino? Because a lot of people say foreign policy is something that belongs to the elite people. This is something very abstract. That this is something that we have to leave to our decision makers, that ordinary Filipinos should not have a say in this. Why should we care? And how could the Filipinos help in terms of this effort to protect our interest in the West Philippine Sea?
I think the Filipinos should unite in terms of helping one another. I think that it's important for us to work together. It's important for us to do what's right, and that includes believing that that we can in some way help one another. In the case of the people who are helping us now, who are supportive, we have this signature campaign. I think that's very encouraging for us. It's I'm sure it's encouraging for the fishermen who want to be helped and who are looking for assistance. I think as a nation, we should be able to stand on a united basis for doing what's right. And it's what kind of a culture do we want to pass on to our children? I think and to our grandchildren. I think all of that is reflective of how we how we help one another, how we react to the problems of other people, where we can be part of the solution. We, of course, are trying to tell our children that there are two important, maybe three important things that they have to remember. Work hard, be kind, pray hard. You know. So this is all part of who we are, and what we are and what we want to be. It's as I said, it's looking to do what's right.
Well, Ambassador, of course, I've noticed that there's a lot of public support for what you guys have been doing here. But what about the response of the Philippine government itself? What was the response that you get from the government? Have they been supportive, or have they been dismissive about this? And what were you expecting from the government?
We have not expected anything from the government. As a matter of fact, the president, when he heard what we were doing, he said, well, every citizen, we're a democracy, every citizen has a right to file. So we thought that was a thoughtful remark on his part. We thanked him for it. But we're prepared to pursue this on the basis of being private citizens. And we're hopeful that we can win this.
I think this is very important, and I should raise it before we close the discussion. The Chinese ambassador said that this is just a fabrication. It has no basis in facts. And also they kind of implied that the ICC, well, didn't imply, they said that the ICC has no jurisdiction over this issue. And then I know that there's a lot of misunderstanding outside that because China is a non-state party to the ICC, they have not even signed it, forget about ratifying it. Therefore, this will never apply to them. Could you kindly explain to our audience, why does the ICC actually have jurisdiction, not only in China, but the Chinese president, even if they're the non-state party?
Well, even as China is not a state party, the fact that crimes have been committed in the Philippines, and the fact that these crimes were committed when the Philippines was a state party, had not yet withdrawn. I think this gives jurisdiction for the ICC to be able to go after China. Not China, but the officials of China.
Specific officials. And I mean, ICC has jurisdiction over specific officials, even though their countries may not be party to the ICC. Because I think that's very important, because there's so much disinformation outside there that there's no basis for ICC to come in, and no less than the Chinese officials seem to be echoing that kind of disinformation.
That's right.
Yeah. How do you see things moving forward in the coming years as far as the Philippines' interests in the West Philippines is concerned, protection of our fishermen, rights is concerned? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? How do you think things are moving forward, or should move forward, perhaps? Yeah.
I think we have to depend on the leadership, and we have to know what that's going to be like. Right now, the leadership is I have to choose my words diplomatically here. It's not the kind of leadership that we're looking for, but maybe there'll be a change in terms of the outlook of our individual leaders. And but right now there is a lot of changes that we hope will be made.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. What about you, Justice? Do you have some
Yes,
final?
going back to your mention of the Chinese ambassador's comment that this is a fabrication,
Right.
in our filing of the communication. In fact, he also said vicious.
Vicious, yeah.
Yes.
Quite, yeah.
When you file a complaint or a manifestation about something being done in your own country, do you call that vicious? Is it not that you are stupid if you don't assert your rights?
Right.
Now he talks also of fabrication. Is it not that it's the Chinese who are fabricating? They're fabricating military installations for their air and naval strips.
And fabricating islands for
Yes,
that matter
right.
over contested land.
It
right?
should be, if there is anyone who should be talking about vicious and fabrications, it should not be the Chinese ambassador.
Right. It should be us. Should raise that. Are there final words that Ambassador you want to say to our audience in terms of our foreign policy and how we should move forward?
I think as I said earlier, we need to continue to do what we think is right, and we need to convince the government that the rule of law must be adhered to, and we need to convince the government that they should listen to the people.
Thank you very much. What about you? Just
Well,
some final words?
I'd like to spell out the fact that if there is any one happy development, that the filing of the communication to the OTC spawned, it is the fact that given the number of supporters, those who are signatories to the petition to support the move of the ambassador and of the ombudsman in filing that communication, it is an indication that the fear of people to speak openly,
Right.
not necessarily against, but disapproval
Yeah.
of the policy, of some of the policies of the government has been quashed or diminished. In other words, people are afraid to talk openly. When we finally filed this, they thought that we were courageous enough
Right.
to do that move. And we take the surge of manifestations of support as I said, I want to say it again, as an indication that indeed people are no longer overcome by fear.
So you broke the barrier in that sense and reminded that we still have a democracy and people have different opinions.
Thank you for saying
Right.
it
Yes.
for us.
Thank you very much, Justice Carpio-Morales,
Thank you
for
too.
joining us. Thank you very much, Ambassador and Foreign Secretary. Maraming salamat for joining us, guys. Looking forward to going to the comment sections. And among other things, please join us soon for our next episode of FYI. Thank you.